I'm going to ask the first question, and then we have a number of questions that came from the audience. Leo, her name, please. If anyone else wishes to ask a question, Carol?
No, not the mic, just give her the index card.
Just the index card so she can give them to, anybody else? We all voted? Thank you. Question for any one of the panelists or the panel as a whole. As a former superintendent, I keep wondering about whether failure informs policy and practice, or we could do something before districts embrace a particular reform that has yet to prove itself worthy of the attention it's been getting. So I wonder, is it because it hits a political sweet spot among elected officials, merit pay, and it sort of takes a life of its own? Or what's the role of the policy community to inform districts about hedging that bet? Or do we wait for failure and then we move on and then something replaces the bad notion of differentiated compensation? So the question, simply put, what's the role that we play as leaders in the policy world, in the research world, to inform districts about the shortfall of different reforms, or do they have to feel the pain and go through it and evolve from that point, and then sort of make a decision collectively for the entire district and community?
You want to go first? Well, I'll go first, and then I'll be very short. A couple things. One is that you know, the difference, the space between policymakers and research is vast. And a lot of times school districts come up, or school leaders, policymakers come up with ideas for schools that they think ought to work regardless of what research might say. And they might even know if a research study is out there on that. You know, Matt's research is readily available. It's really right there in Google. You can look it all up. I've done it many, many times and read it. The second thing is about failure. And this is probably the most important piece I want to talk about. School districts have huge institutional memories. And if you don't do something well the first time, they're going to remember. And it's going to be hard to go back and say, oh, but now we really learned how to do it right. And so institutional memory is a hard thing to overcome. And especially if the system failed miserably and people were victims of the failure, they're not going to be in a big hurry to try it once again. And so I encourage people who are trying to do this is go slow, get it right the first time, because going back the second time is much harder. And it's not you know, in my slides, I talked about putting a strategic thing in place of learning as you go, but it's not about failure as much as learning what works and what doesn't work in a experimental situation.
And I definitely agree with all of that. I think the one piece I would add too is oftentimes these systems are put in place, they're championed by a single individual, and that's the school superintendent. And I think it just came out from the Council of Great City Schools showing that the tenure of superintendents in the United States school system has actually decreased over time. And since the last time they gave the survey, I think it was like 2.8 years, because I always use the number 3 whenever I cite this. But it actually showed it go down to 2.3 years. So you have a superintendent come into the school system championing major compensation reform. They're there for 2.3 years. They're gone. That system's gone too. And particularly as we think about times of fiscal stress and uncertainty, I mean, it's these add-on programs, and this is where I really think we need to kind of reculture the profession and build it from the bottom up, is the panelists have kind of shared today.
Can I just add one thing? So I think the kind of work that Shimon and his colleagues are doing is just absolutely critical. Because, you know, I think we haven't provided real evidence of enduring success at more than a single school. And so I think a great many policymakers have simplistic notions about what it takes to improve schools, but you can't replace simplistic notions unless you have something better. And in that regard, I think a challenge that educators and those who study education face is showing that professional development can make a difference. I mean, as Shimon pointed out, most districts spend a quite substantial amount of money on professional development. If you included the pay for master's degrees in that, it's a vast amount of money. But I think, almost all studies show no impact on professional development as currently done on improving the performance of teachers. Many of my economist colleagues will say that's because it doesn't matter. We just need to find terrific people and have them teach. Well, I'm sure that's wrong. I mean, I'm completely sure that professional development defined as enhancing the skills of in-service teachers, and there's lots of ways to do it. We saw one in the 4-minute video, has to be a part of improving public education. But we, as a community, haven't done very well in demonstrating that it works.
If I may, Cliff, what's interesting is, and I went through the Distinguished Urban Superintendent's Program at Harvard. I missed Richard, unfortunately, the year I was there, but I'm glad to see you here. We read, required reading was Richard's books. And I want to share, there's an enormous divide, I would say, Cliff, between policy and the aspirations of policy and what's actually happening daily in the classrooms. We want something wonderful for our children. Look, for 30 slots I had to fill in the three schools of teachers, I had 300 applications. 150 of the applications, the folk couldn't write. Another 75 of the applicants couldn't speak very well, the English language. Right? And so, and they're all have master's degrees, they're all licensed teachers. All right? I'm just, and so Joel Klein is my mentor, and I said with him, we're not attracting tier 1 candidates in this profession. I'm getting just a few here and there. I'm getting them, thank goodness. I was able to fill all 30 slots with really good people, but we have a very strenuous hiring process, a 6-step hiring process that involves multiple angles in terms of looking at an individual. But the reason why I say this is because unless, and I think it's been echoed here in this panel, unless we make this profession attractive in a way in which folks say, who are coming out of tier 1, and what I mean by tier 1 is folk who are graduating, right, in the top 10% of their universities. That's the case in Finland, right? We all know in Finland, it's the top 10%. That's the same in South Korea. But here in the United States, we're drawing from the bottom third of the graduating classes out of universities. I have this theory, I call it the theory of the fish tank, You know how fish grow the size of a fish tank? It's an amazing phenomenon. You put a little shark, a baby shark in a fish tank, it'll be this big its entire life. If you put it in the ocean, it'll grow its natural size. So too, I think, between students and teachers. The more expansive the mind of the teachers, the more we'll be able to expand the minds of children. But the opposite is also true. Unfortunately, we have a lot of that opposite. And I think the question that we're all grappling with here is, how do we make sure that the education profession becomes attractive to the top 10%? What I think we're all saying, pay is a component, but not the whole shebang. You have to think of all the other systems of school to make it worthwhile, that you feel efficacy as a teacher in the school, and that there's a sense of collective efficacy as a school community.
I want to get to all of the questions coming from the audience. Let me raise this one to Rob, colleague on my left. Could you discuss the potential conflicts and trade-offs between building collaboration among teachers and of differentiating their compensation? I'll follow it with a second question, but that's the first.
I think, I think one of the things that we're learning on the panel is that we have to look at the profession differently. The part about collaboration, that is the future of education in the United States, whether if we don't do it, our future of education in the United States is limited. If we do it, it has great potential. But our systems that we create have to grow that. My slide that talked about organizational growth systems talked about you can create systems that encourage, that support, that do those kind of things. I'm going to use a line from Andreas Schleicher from OECD, who talks about collaboration. His work is, he says, it doesn't fall from the sky. You have to create structures that increase it. That's what all these other successful and that's what we saw on the panel. The structures are there.
We didn't talk before this.
I know.
want you to know.
We were
It was
just laughing about that. But you have to create structures. So there is a way to create compensation systems that build that collaboration, that encourage it, that strengthen it. The problem we have is we have in the United States sometimes a culture of, I'll name a few things. You're fired, get out, all this culture about there's one person that will overcome everything. And, if you don't, you're voted off the island. We need to start thinking about how the island can be pretty effective by everybody working together. And that's really not in our school culture right now. And so this is the shift people are talking about on the panel. They're all talking about the shift in the profession. Compensation can be a positive force in that, but only if it is as informed as the need to change the profession itself. Thinking of compensation as one person's pay versus another person's pay versus another person's pay, it will not be successful.
Could I add one comment to that?
Sure.
So, this 4-minute description of the 9th grade team meeting is quite interesting. On our website, there are transcripts with the key people who involved in that. And what you see is the amount of structure that goes into those meetings. Some people think of collaboration, again, just happening. Each of the grade level team leaders meets for at least 90 minutes with the principal and assistant principal every week with a plan in enormous detail how every minute of these 90-minute weekly grade level team meetings are going to take place. So that's high structure. And notice the accountability. This Matthew McCray, the science teacher, had spent weeks in developing this template for a lab report. But the scrutiny that went under from his colleagues. Also, if you notice at the very end, the lead 9th grade teacher gave an assignment to every one of the people in that to guarantee for the next time. So now some might say this seems to be a violation of teacher professionalism. Well, that's not how these teachers see it. These teachers say, my time is really valuable. If I'm going to come to a meeting, I want that time used very well, and that takes planning.
The second part of that question, I think, was covered more than adequately, but I'll read it for the record. Does differentiated compensation result in envy, even jealousy, in a feeling that one needs to look out for oneself? I think unless you want to add.
I was gonna, first, I'm proud that nobody's thrown anything at me yet, so I'm pretty happy with that. But in terms of this question, I don't have data that's going to speak directly to that. I think, some of the stuff we've seen in Texas and other places is teachers will express more concern about the system before the system's implemented. But once they've experienced that system, over time, they tend to accept it more. So it doesn't speak directly to that the specific words used in that question, but it's possible. But again, I don't have any evidence to speak directly to it.
This is to Shimon. It says, what are the funding amounts for your 3 schools? And it sounds technical, but I'm sure there's a
Oh, that's a
lot more
great question.
underneath that.
It's a great
But you
question.
could you respond?
Sure, it's a great question because we're paying on average teachers 38% more than the rest of the Department of Education, and we have a ratio between teachers and students of 15-1. And you're saying, well, where do you get that money? So we have the same funding as all the other public schools. And what I want to say is, you remember being a teacher and there are assistant principals in the school, there are coaches in the school, there are school aides who are in charge of the photocopying machine. Who remembers those school aides? We don't have those, right? So each teaching team has their own photocopying machine. We actually trust our teachers with a photocopier. Right? I hear, wow. We have very little overhead. We put the resources in the front line. You see, most traditional schools, they have enormous amount of reserves, what I would call, people who are not in the front line of teaching, right? So you have all those school aides, the assistant principals, humma. They cost a lot of money. You get rid of that entire layer of bureaucracy in a school, and instead you turn it into teachers teaching in the front line with children. You don't need those people. It's just thinking of the same resources, but saying, where am I going to maximize those resources? I believe that the point of contact that the children have is the teacher. That's where the resources need to be. Pay the teachers well, get a 15-1 ratio, which is what research has shown to be very effective. You know, between 15-1 and like 8-1 is almost no difference, right? Once you get above 15-1, you can see it just drops in terms of the effectiveness. So I would say it is entirely doable to have a career ladder with good compensation if you reorganize the school resources.
Let me just continue with you. Question, are you contemplating the addition of bonuses, and how would they be done, individual or team, and might they impact collaboration in the culture of the schools?
So when we were first looking at the contract, we did contemplate team-based bonuses. The idea, and this goes to the question in terms of fixed costs, right? And the Department of Education was very wary because, well, hold on a second, Shimon, you're paying on average 38% more. You want to add bonuses, you want to add sabbaticals, you want to add everything to the teachers. They're saying, well, let's hold on, let's just give you at least the career ladder, and let's see how that goes. But the idea of bonuses, if it's to the individual, it can create a perverse incentive, because I don't want to share with you what I know, right? Because there are limited bonuses. And so it limits collaboration. Whereas if it's a bonus to any team that is able to meet a certain criteria, that can blow out the fixed costs. And so you have to be very careful in terms of designing that. I think what we settled on in terms of the career ladder is showing effectiveness as it is.
To Matthew, just a comment, and we seek a comment from you on this comment. Most measures of teacher effectiveness are not valid.
That's a good, if I said that, I probably didn't elaborate enough. I was really worried about my
Oh, I'm
time
not sure
there.
the person is saying you said that.
Oh, okay.
This is just how it's written.
With things like individual level teacher value added, we see that the intertemporal stability of that, the change in over time, tends to be quite great because there's a lot of noise in test scores, right? But in terms of trained experts going into and observing a classroom multiple times per year, that may have less noise in it than, say, a test score that is at one point, 158 days into the school year, and it takes a student 90 minutes to complete, right? Parent feedback, as we heard from Shimon, is that a good measure, right? So I think that in terms of saying ruling all these measures out, I don't think is probably the right way to address it. I think putting a bunch of these measures together to get an overall picture of individual teacher effectiveness, team effectiveness, even school effectiveness can be appropriate.
All right, before we go to Dr. Murnane, you want to get in?
Yeah, I want.
Go ahead, Rob.
But I wanted to make sure, and I agree with Matt with all that, the multiple measures, but it's also the focus of that work. If the focus is just to make an evaluation using all those measures, you're just doing the accountability thing again and you're not growing the organization. It's the use of those measures as well. The focus, if you create a system that's about organizational growth, you're using those measures to grow the system, not just to measure it. And that is a huge difference. Now, it takes a lot of work to do that. It's not easy. It's a lot easier to just sit with an Excel spreadsheet at the end of the year and just, run the thing and this name is at the top. It takes a lot of work. But the difference is kids do better when you focus on their growth and not focusing on, things that are 2 steps away from it. So I want to say that it's not about just how we measure or what measures we use, but it's how those measures are integrated into the system. And I just wanted to say that.
Dr. Murnane, I'm going to start with you, but others certainly allowed to jump in the conversation on this next question. Is there evidence that compensation is linked to retention of highly effective teachers?
There is evidence that the answer is yes, at least in the short run. I mean, in other words, in the first years of a career, and that's of course where all the attrition is. So yes, I mean there are a number of studies that show that. One that my group's done, at least one that Matt's group has done.
Matt, would you want to?
I
Do you want to name, give some particular information to the study, either one of you two?
Well, Jennifer Steele and John Willett and I studied a program in California when California had money, in which it provided.
And when was that?
Well, before the dot-com bust, basically, in the late 1990s, it provided a substantial $20,000 in extra compensation for teachers who, on the basis of their test scores, looked like they had great promise as teachers if they would stay 4 years. And that did increase markedly the percentage of these young folks who were at least academically talented who stayed for at least 4 years.
And I'll add on the bottom of the slide that talks about effective teacher retention bonuses, I provide a site to our paper, and you should just be able to Google it as well. I think the other major study that people point to as well was an $1,800 retention bonus, I think for math and science teachers in North Carolina, that folks could look up as well.
But could I just, it's the wrong way of looking at it, it seems to me. You want to think about, for the kind of folks you want to attract, if you want to retain for an extended period of time, you got to say, where's the job growth? I mean, how do you make it into a job that has new challenges, that people can get up in the morning after they've done this for 4 or 5 years and say, wow, I've got some new things I want to do. I can share what I've learned. I have new opportunities to learn. So that this really is, Rob's point is that to look at the compensation separately from the conditions of work, the opportunities to learn, the opportunities to make a difference, makes no sense.
I've got another educational real estate question, and it asks, where do you see places that are taking on compensation reform well, and in a larger context of school system reform?
You're in the field all the time.
I want to talk about this, but I want to talk about it a little differently. I think the question probably was focused on the United States, and I think I'd like you to answer what like your system there, because I thought that was wonderful. But I want to talk about Singapore. And the reason I want to talk about Singapore is about how they approach compensation in the Singaporean schools. They take it off the table. That's what they say. They say compensation for our teachers is off the table, and people in this world think that means it's not negotiated. Well, Singapore is a monarchy, so it probably isn't negotiated, but what they mean by that is they make sure it's not something their teachers worry about. They say we're going to pay teachers and we're going to have a compensation system, and they do have some bonuses, and they do have a career ladder system that's one of the most developed in the world. But what they say is, but we want the compensation system to be a part of the teacher's growth as a person and as a teacher. The reason we take the amount of money off the table is because we don't want our teachers worrying about paying bills and those kind of things. We want them going home worrying about how they meet their kids' needs in the classroom tomorrow. That's what we want them to worry about. That's a compensation system that has the right perspective. That's the compensation system that we have to look for. If we're going to have a true profession, think of the professions out there in the world that we talk about in this country. You can name them, doctor, lawyer, whatever you want to call professions. How many of those people go home at night and worry about that, or do they worry about improving their practice the next day? That's what you got to look at. And if we have a system, I'm maybe going back to the retention bonus thing, but so many of our kids come into teaching in their first few years with such a huge burden of debt from college that these bonuses are just seen as, it'll get me past one more year of paying back those big loans. But once that goes away, then you can see what's going to happen to the retention because it's the entire structure. So I think there are systems out there that we should learn from, and not, we should never adopt anything because their system is not the same as ours. But I think we can look past just how the money flows to a paycheck. And I think that is it's a different way of looking at the profession. And I think a couple people up here have talked about that.
The one, you go ahead. I was going to say the one component I'll add too, just in terms of locations across the U.S., in terms of student learning objectives, which can be a component of differentiated compensation systems. I think Austin, Texas, has probably put the most thought and work into that over the past 6, 7, 8 years, in terms of really working with teacher associations and other key stakeholders in the design, development, implementation, and long-term sustainability. Denver, Colorado has done a pretty remarkable job. In terms of willingness to partner educational research practice and policy together and study programs, New York City, Nashville, Tennessee, Round Rock, Texas, had open doors in terms of making sure that researchers were at the table. I'm not saying I would necessarily design the programs in those ways, but in terms of learning from them, I think those were incredible opportunities. Texas went big and threw a ton of money into pay-for-performance systems, and they were studied along the way. But again, what is politically feasible to implement may not necessarily be a great incentive system. And the example I use from Texas, and this is from some of my early educator compensation system work, but is in the law written up for GEAG and TEAG program, it said that the minimum bonus should be $3,000. There's a difference between should and must. And we found that virtually, I think it was like 95% of all bonuses were less than $3,000, right? So how a system is intended to be implemented and how that system is actually implemented in practice can be incredibly different. And so those are some examples I at least have from places I've studied.
I think we as a country just face an enormous challenge. And while I think some things can be learned from looking at the Singapores and the Finlands, I think we need to be careful because we're in a situation in which we have almost 4 million teachers, a significant percentage of whom are first-generation college students who didn't get a very good education. I think of my own parents among them, who of course are no longer teaching, but they were first generation to go to college. They went to not very good public institutions where they didn't get deep subject matter knowledge. They basically taught as best they could over whole careers. But they could not, and what they did was quite good for their day. but not nearly good enough to help kids master these Common Core standards by any means. Now, and there are an awful lot of the teaching profession are folks who were just like my parents, were educated in not very good institutions, did not leave with deep subject matter knowledge, but now are being asked to do something that no prior generation of American teachers has ever done. And how we move from there to something that looks like Singapore or Finland is not at all obvious to me, and I think it's an immense challenge. I think I'm not sure what we do, but it's very tough because we have too many teachers who are doing the best they can, but without the knowledge and the skills to be able to do what is now being asked of them.
I want to migrate back to one of the major themes that continues to get attention here, and rightly so, and that is having collaboration become a matter of practice within schools. And the question before you is, what needs to change at the system-wide level for teachers to have time to collaborate as they do in the video that you shared with us, Dr. Murnane? So maybe starting with you and then coming back towards me.
Well, I think there has to be, this work I've been doing in Boston currently has been a real eye-opener for me about, how much time school principals spend doing, helping deal with operational challenges, and rather than being in classrooms, working with teachers to improve instruction. So I think very few urban school districts. I remember in Boston won this Broad Prize for being a particularly good urban school district, but it's not well organized to support the faculty and the leadership in individual schools. And we need to figure out how to do that a lot better.
There were two slides that were shown by my colleagues here, by Matt and Rob, and those slides led to a video, so to speak, that Richard showed. And I don't know if it's at all possible. Could we pull up the slides that we have from Matt in terms of the recruitment, selection, induction? Is it possible? No, they're good.
There it is, right? That's right there.
Ah,
How about that? That was good.
outstanding. So you have to look at the entire system, from recruiting, to how do you sell your school? You saw an article by David Brooks. That article by David Brooks, I got tons of phone calls and emails from across the country of teachers saying, well, I want to work in your school. That's where I want to be. And so how do we select? We're looking for certain kind of attributes. If a person is a lone wolf and they can't collaborate with others, they can't work in a team. They may be brilliant. They may actually even be excellent teachers. But if they can't collaborate, and a lot of folk don't know how to collaborate, they wouldn't be able to work well in the system. How we induct them. Well, that's one of the things that Leo and I made sure. We have a 5-week summer training program that's very carefully designed so that the team becomes a team. And they learn the skills of collaborating. Because, the way I lay out my classroom is going to be really different from Matthew's and from Richard's and from Rob's. How do we all sit down together and create a coherent system? We need time to do that. Our values are going to clash. You may say, gum's okay in the classroom. I'll be horrified. Gum should never be in a classroom. But we need to sort of come up with an agreement and a consensus of what is it going to look like in our classrooms. Professional development. The professional development is a key to this, but it has to be a key based on the needs of that particular teacher. Can't be on the needs of what someone else thinks, because if that teacher doesn't feel it's a need, It's going to go in one ear and out the other. And it's got to be a need at that particular point of time. And unless the team is nimble enough, you can't do that. Performance management and evaluation, compensation, career progression. Notice all of these components is looking at it in a holistic way in order to be able to say, I want to work in your school. I have, what's fascinating is when I share this model in different places I've gone, people say, well, I want to work in your school. I said, that's wonderful. Why don't you go ahead and apply? But that should be across the country, so to speak. It should be in every superintendent that people should say, I want to work in your district. I want to be part of this. We don't hear that. And the reason why we don't hear that, Cliff, is because it's a dead-end profession. And nobody wants to be in a dead-end profession. They want to be in a .com. They want to be, the young entrepreneurs of tomorrow. And it's just not, there's no pizzazz in education. And unless we change it, whether it's on the ground, at the district level, at the policy level, I don't care how it's done. It's just got to be done. I'm doing my small, attempt in New York City, but it shouldn't be, there are others across the country who are also trying to do things. There are experiments taking place all over. The American spirit, in terms of us not sort of just sitting around and just waiting for things to change, there are folk really trying, and you heard it from all the panelists. There's a lot of folk doing different things all over. And God willing, as these panels and as we educate ourselves and we find out what's working and what's not working, when we expand on the things that work and get rid of the things that don't work, which is really our entire traditional system.
Let me come back to you on the same question with not a twist, but an implication. Have you found time in the daily, weekly schedule beyond that which takes place when kids are not there, during the summer or else, to build a way by which teachers can collaborate during the regular schedule?
So Cliff,
That's
Yeah.
what was at the heart of the question, I
sure,
think.
sure. So for instance, the hour and a half of collaborative time daily. How do you do that? Because that's an enormous chunk of the school day that you're just spending planning. Well, I was a military officer. If you fail to plan to fail, right? So you just got to plan. You got to work together. Finding the time, not that incredibly impossible. So the school day for teachers is slightly longer than the school day for students. So the students come in at 8:30 in the morning. They have breakfast. They have exercise. At 9:30, they start instruction. The teachers come in at 8. So while the students are having breakfast and exercise daily, and they're meeting half an hour earlier, so it's an hour and a half that the teachers have to collaborative daily. It's just being imaginative about the schedule.
I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to come back to you. Part of what I do as moderator is to make sure I'm faithful to the questions in the intent and the way that they're organized. So I'm coming back to you on a question about, do you have plans to keep the current grade level structure or go beyond that? To our headmaster.
So we began with elementary school. I earned my laurels as a middle school teacher and principal. And the goal is really continuity of relationships. So yes, we're going to have K through 5. God willing, we'll have a middle school that will be maybe like a 6 through 8 loop, and then a high school which will be a 9 through 12 loop. So the students will stay with the same teachers over an extended period of time.
Okay, we're getting near our witching hour, and I want to give time for each of the panelists to summarize what they've heard, connected with what they have researched and the practice that they've rendered in their respective communities. But here's a question that some of you may want to address prior to the summary time, just before 2 o'clock. Question: what can be done to ensure that human capital approaches, such as merit pay bonuses, don't work at cross purposes with social capital improvements. Teachers helping teachers.
Well, I think perhaps the best evidence are initiatives such as Schimmons that have shown that alternatives really do a better job. You know, you can't beat a horse without a horse. And I think we haven't done a very good job of creating models that have some scale, that have shown some durability, that have been shown to do a better job. And I think that's a key piece of what we need.
I'm going to move to summary. And I'm going to lead with my colleague to my left, Rob.
Okay. Thank you, Cliff, and thanks to the panel, and thank you for inviting me to be here today to speak. The Shanker Institute, a wonderful opportunity. I appreciate it greatly. I think I'm just going to summarize very quickly. There are 4 people up here that come from very different places, and they're coming together saying basically the same thing. There is a path forward. There is knowledge. There is a knowledge base, and now we have to figure out how we operationalize this knowledge base. We do it with examples, but we have to. But little. President Weingarten once said, little islands of success, we need to get past islands. We need to have a movement across the country. And that requires our country taking education seriously. The stuff about the report in 83, Nation at Risk, excuse me, I forgot the name of it. I shouldn't. I was teaching at the time. I was risking myself. That maybe we need to think about schools moving differently. We were disarming schools back in 83, and we haven't done anything with it. This is a national security issue. This is national policy. I know local schools are a local concern, but if we keep on doing it a little bit here and a little bit here, we are not going to get anywhere, because this is a big country, and we need a big effort. We need to get to your last question, we need to start thinking about teaching as a profession. We need to stop thinking as teachers as widgets in the system and at the most powerful resource of the system. That's the shift that has to happen. If you listen up here, the success is when those systems figure out that the teachers they have in their schools or the teachers they bring to their schools are the solution to their problem and not the problem itself. And that's what we have to have. And so compensation or differentiating compensation can be a piece of that, but only if we have that overall change in the profession. If we don't have that, we're going to have there's going to be another panel here a couple years from now talking about all the little pieces that are out there.
Thanks, Rob. First, I want to thank everyone here, and I want to thank the distinguished panelists. I've really enjoyed meeting all of you. Cliff, thank you very much, and Leo, thank you for inviting me. I want to say that why are you here today? What drove you to come here to the Al Shanker Institute? We all want better answers. We all want something for our children. I know I want something better for my children. I have 6 children, Kanai. And if you think Jewish schools are any better, no. And they're facing the same things. In fact, in Jewish schools, I would say in many of them, the children look at the top-down authoritarian structure of the school equated with Judaism and say, I don't want any of this, and leave Judaism altogether. They're catastrophic failures in many cases. I'm speaking from the heart, because from our heart, we want what's best for our future. The problem that we face today is that the traditional school was designed very effectively. It is designed to produce the results it's producing. It is literally designed for that. And the problem is system design. we're stuck in a system design that may have worked in the 1920s and 1930s, but is woefully inadequate today. So the question is, how do we innovate our way out of it? The charter movement began as one option, and it was supposed to be a room, and Al Shanker was very much part of the charter movement. He wanted the charter movement. But the problem with what the charter movement became is we don't need a social contract. In fact, a social contract binds us in a way in which we can't move forward. Look, we live with a constitution. We have a social contract. The labor movement is a social contract. All three schools, we want a social contract. We're not moving away from the labor union movement. There's a reason for that. Because a social contract will live on. True innovation will happen through that. Just like the Constitution of the United States was a social contract, which was an enormous innovation for the world at the time, which has spawned other countries to adopt social contracts of their own. So too do we need a better social contract for our teachers. And when school communities and experiments across the country come with the right nexus, and this is where sort of Harvard language comes in, because it's the nexus between theory and practice, right? Once the theory and the practice are aligned, and everybody says it makes sense and it works, then we as a nation can move forward. What is enormously exciting for me in being here is that I have a distinguished panelist here who may have known about New American, may not have known about New American, but through this panel have learned of a new way, a new experiment that's out there that may be an answer. I'm not saying it's the answer, but it's an answer. And I think by highlighting the different approaches that folk are taking throughout the country and then evaluating whether those systems work, and I agree with Rob, you can't go fast. If all of a sudden you say, whoa, we want to do exactly what's happening right there and blow it up and do it, I would say, no, don't do it. We're not ready yet. No. We're still learning a lot. There's issues of capacity. How do you build leadership that is collaborative in nature, that doesn't say, I have the answer, as opposed to being humble enough to say, well, what do you think? Most leaders become leaders because they say, I know the answer. The leadership that we're looking for is the leadership that says, I don't have the answer, maybe you do. That's a dramatic shift in the way of thinking. What I'm sharing with you is that I'm full of hope for our country and its future and our future citizens. I'm very grateful for the Al Shanker Institute and the great work that they're doing in terms of gathering intellectual and other resources so that we can move forward with better social contracts for our teachers.
That's great. Thank you to everyone, too, for coming, as well as good to see some familiar faces that I haven't seen for a while, so that's always fun as well. And I think just the closing note I want to emphasize is something that's pretty near and dear to me and stuff that at least I try to do every day within my academic work, and that's continuing to link educational research, practice, and policy. On this panel here, we have researchers. On this panel here, we have policymakers. On this panel here, we have practitioners. We have people who've served in both those roles, or all three of those roles, potentially, right? And it's bringing these groups together that we're actually going to be able to make some meaningful change. I reference our retention bonus program in Tennessee. Tennessee approved the program for an additional year based upon our first year findings. We were able to provide them information about where implementation might have went wrong a little bit, and they're able to change some practices. And by being able to step out from writing, my academic journal articles that I need to do for things within the profession, I'm always making sure that I reach back out to the group in which I was studying and that they get real meaningful information from that. And until we all begin to work together along those lines, I don't think meaningful change is going to occur. And I think we're going to continue to repeat ourselves. We're going to have study over study of differentiated compensation that we've been doing since the 1950s, right? And until we begin to learn and really make meaningful change, again, I think it's just going to keep on spinning that wheel.
I share my fellow panelists' thank you to the Shanker Institute for having this opportunity to talk about this important issue. I look at it from the perspective of, where is the nation going? And we've had growing family income inequality over the last several decades that has resulted in growing gaps in educational outcomes as measured by test scores, as measured by educational attainments between children growing up in relatively affluent families and those growing up in poor families. And I think those growing gaps jeopardize a value that I think almost all Americans hold dear, and that is the idea of upward mobility. A child may grow up poor, but the kind of American ethos is if she works hard, her children will not grow up poor. And I think that's enormously threatened. Now, this is not a problem of educators making by any means, but unfortunately, while education was always important as the path to upward mobility, it's much more so today than it was in the past. So although the problem is by no means of the educators making, if this is going to turn around, those of us who care about education have really got to figure out better ways to serve particularly America's poor children well.
I think you've held your throwable things to Matthew, to Dr. Murnane, of course, to our headmaster and Rob. But let's seriously give this panel what they deserve.